eventually getting there. All right, great. I'm going to go back to the first slide and start over. Just kidding. Um, but yeah, so just a couple of housekeeping items too in terms of the Zoom meeting. I know that we have a good amount of people here tonight, which is fantastic. That being said, once we get into sort of that third item with the web tool activity, we will plan to split folks up into breakout rooms. We are relatively novice at navigating breakout rooms and bringing them back together and doing all that. So I'm going to express gratitude for your patience up front on that, but I think we'll get it done. And all that is to say, once we get into those breakout rooms, we want to just encourage folks to, come off mute and have this be a more sort of collaborative session. This, we want to, as I mentioned, go light on the presenting and more so really hear from folks. So coming off mute is great. If you prefer to also use the chat, either both are excellent. And if you're sort of on the move as well, just whatever makes the most sense. But yeah, just to get that out there right away, as well as we go through things, feel free to throw up a hand or an emoji or just come off mute with any questions. So with that, we'll sort of jump into the admin items. So the couple quick updates there is just that we do have those member lists on the project website if you haven't seen that already. And you want to just double check that the information you shared is included correctly, or if there's anything you wanted to add or revise, happy to make those updates. The virtual card sort activity is live on the Community Insights form, which is also, as a reminder, just located on that project website. So we're able to, get all the kinks sorted out there to make sure that folks can participate in that activity. And yeah, those are sort of the most noteworthy items there. And then just as we move towards August, so front-ending this just as we start to talk about the work and what the sort of action items or sort of take-home work that we'll have following this meeting are, how that's going to sort of be covered in the next meeting. So when we come back in August, our intent is to have, draft evaluation, draft scenarios, excuse me, for you all to and us all to evaluate and discuss as a group, sort of that first cycle of options, if you will. And with that, also looking at what that collective input from you all has shown. So with the committee work, which is noted down below, and sort of looking at those roll-ups by steering committee group. So each committee as well as just the overall sort of details that we're getting. And then the intent is also to have, some more firm information, dates, locations, et cetera, for the fall engagement plan, and just sort of having a conversation around how folks, can use even just like the engagement sheet that we did in the first meeting, reaching out to your constituents and constituencies, but also just trying to really drive strong turnout at those events. So the pre-work items that are noted at the bottom here, the policy initiative evaluation form, which more to come on that a little later in the meeting, and then the individual weighting strategy. So we really, really want to make sure that we get everyone to submit an individual weighting strategy if you have not already. So what we're going to be putting together is just, we're in the process of pulling together basically a spreadsheet that is showing, have you submitted a weighting strategy? What date you submitted it on. If you've submitted more than one, we'll keep sort of a tally so that we know we've received the right amount and the date and sort of the last version that we are referencing, so that when we pull all those together to look at people's input, making sure that we're referencing sort of the right version of it, if you will, and any other sort of important details as we get that pulled together. So that'll all be coming this week. All right. So just maybe a quick show of virtual hands or thumbs up emojis. Folks have had a chance to watch the how-to video, or if you've been at one of the regional meetings, obviously we've had that conversation, but great. So yeah, excellent. So glad to hear that folks have had a chance to do that. So yeah, sort of the activity that we wanted to spend time on tonight, is going through the tool. So just reiterating, and I know these are all points that we covered in those previous, the sort of introductory meeting and the how-to video, but what the tool is used for, adjusting those criterias to try to determine what the right prioritization is within each strategy candidate group. and then just highlighting that this would be one of multiple inputs that sort of help inform those draft scenarios. And then obviously continuing forward with informing and shaping the final recommendations that'll come out of all of this. So yeah, just wanting to make sure we highlighted that. So before we move into this activity where we sort of talk through each item, what we'd like to do is spend time, if possible, going through each of the strategy candidate groups that have weighting available and working, in the small sort of breakout room groups to try to determine collectively what feels right. What we have found in going through the regional meetings is that it's, not always as easy to sort of collectively determine if people feel polarized on one item, which sort of emphasizes the importance of that individual weighting strategy. But at least to sort of talk through the thinking and hear how other people might be, sort of digesting and working through some of these criteria and how they could or could not inform the prioritization list. So we'll definitely touch on that. And before we split into the breakout room groups. We'll want to just, we'll take some time to quickly spin through it just as a reminder, just for a couple minutes. And then any questions that folks have in terms of technical quirks, there, are still a bug or two that we want to make sure we're getting ironed out, but don't want to operate under the assumption that we've heard it all already. So if there's anything you want to flag, we want to make sure we create space for that. So we'll also cover additional considerations. I know some of you have already flagged those in email form, which is awesome. I'm really happy to get that already, and obviously with the weighting scenarios too, filling in those text box. And then we had just some discussion questions to sort of help ground and guide the conversation and thinking through those. So the discussion questions will come in a second, but first we just wanted to sort of revisit the guiding principles for the project that were both the first and the last step in the overall process that we had laid out during that first phase. Hopefully you're familiar with these, but I'll read through them quickly. So the 8 guiding principles, first being right sizing to address over and underutilization, access to high quality programming, minimizing disproportionate impacts, equitable resource allocation, appropriately staffed schools, access to high quality buildings with appropriate spaces, ensuring long-term district financial sustainability, and strengthening schools as community hubs. So again, we want to make sure that as we think through not just the prioritization piece, but policy and everything else, that we are sort of staying connected to these goals and guiding principles that had been laid out early on in the project, and we're connected to district strategic priorities as well. Any questions on this before I move forward? All right, excellent. So the discussion questions that we came up with, and we'll go ahead and drop those into the chat as well so that people have them as we move to sort of the shared screen to get into the breakout room groups eventually. But really wanting folks to just start to think about, and again, grounding everything in that student experience point. If we really boil down, the goal of this project is to improve the student experience. So thinking about the potential impacts, intended or unintended impacts on student experience and some of these prioritization pieces, how a certain approach or weighting of a criteria might help minimize disproportionate impacts, or create a more equitable system for potentially communities that have been historically underserved. Number 3 being long-term sustainability. So from a financial perspective, operational perspective, how might that be a priority? And all of that sort of rolled up into this last question of, does this make sense in a long-term fashion? So really sort of, beating the drum on not wanting to be sort of chasing after getting one school to a certain spot on a certain list, or one school at the top, or a group of schools in one way or the other. But if we look ahead 5, 10, 15 years with this sort of methodology and like big scale sort of approach make sense? And if not, or if there are things that might be new variables or factors that would require changes, what might those be? Just so they're sort of on the radar, and knowing that there's a lot changing, on a national scale with public education and some of the supports that have historically been in place. So just being thoughtful about all of that. All right. So I am gonna pull up the application here. And as I said, I'll just do a really quick spin through. So I'm glad to hear everyone is familiar. Obviously, we've got the key terms. I know that how-to video has been shared, not yet plugged in. There are a couple of things that have come up in other meetings that I'll point out as we go, but obviously you can select by individual school and school board district. So one of the things, questions that has come up, just to speak to it, and I think it was helpful to inform, is how does the district shifting away from the regional support structure from an academic perspective, if and how that might impact this group. And the short answer is it should not impact our work. Our goal with the regions was really to make sure that we had regional perspective at the table so that we can hear from folks who are sort of representing different corners of the district. And we still think that that is accomplished with the 4 regions, and the school board districts, are also regionally placed. So when we're trying to sort of, slice and dice data from a geographic perspective, we still have a clear and sort of long-standing lens with which to do that. So you've got a lot of information about the school here as you scroll down. I won't go through all of it. And then you can also, as I showed before, look at the roll-ups by school board district. You can look at information, you know, um, from a geographic perspective on an interactive map here with each strategy candidate group. And then a lot of information on this step 3 tab. You can see summaries by group, um, individual school details, sort of an equity breakdown and impacts that are being had based on, some of these groupings, and then that geographic perspective as well with the regional analysis and being able to sort of toggle off the categories that you may be more or less interested in looking at. So I know I moved through that quick, but wanting to really, spend the majority of our time on step 4, just with how these scores are. So um, a couple more quick notes, but obviously with ongoing monitoring and evaluation, there are no weights because these are schools that are, generally operating at a healthy level, and are not, the determination is that they don't need sort of an immediate intervention, or wouldn't be a high priority. That the building score is relatively good, the utilization rate is relatively good. So they're sorted into that group. And then site-specific evaluation, maybe schools where um, a sort of an investment approach may not make sense to address some of the challenges they're facing, where if you have a school that is over-enrolled, but has and may be a good candidate for a building addition, except that there is no space on the physical site for the building to expand, it may require a more policy-based approach, or sort of operational approach to address some of those challenges. So just wanted to speak to those 2 quickly. And then last but not least, a question that we know has come up a couple times is just about sort of the weighting bit here in terms of things going from 0 to 100%, and if all of them are at 100% or all of them are at 0%, how does that work? So if all are at 0 or 100, nothing is really weighted. They're all sort of even, and they don't all add up to 100, because I think it's just a little easier to think about it on maybe a scale of 0 to 10 in terms of how important a criteria is, 10 being the most important, or 100%, rather than sort of having them equally tally up. So you've got the details here just in terms of how those priority scores, which is that first column after the school name, are calculated, normalizing the data on a specific scale, just so those can be rolled up in an apples to apples way. But yeah, I think those are the biggest items I wanted to touch on. And so before we get into the breakout rooms, any questions from like a technical perspective, bugs or questions you had about any of like the data itself in terms of trying to make sense of it, and less so like a subjective feeling or perspective on it?
Hey, Nate, can you hear me?
Can hear you. Yep. Go ahead, bud.
I was a little confused by the weighting, like the example given in the weighting said like 75% utilization equals 60% weighting. And I was just wondering, is that a typo or am I just not understanding how that's working?
Yeah. So we want to they're all normalized on the exact same scale. And in terms of that specific one, don't know that I can speak to it right now, but the idea being that, you know, obviously utilization, easy to look at a scale from 0 to 100, given that it is percentage, although there are schools that go above, so that sort of rattles that. But then when you're looking at some of the other factors, they aren't on a neat scale in the same way. So I know the math isn't broken out here, but yeah, I can plan to circle back with you on that specific item. I'm just not sure that I have the detail to answer it.
Okay, no worries. I was just
Hmm.
curious.
Yep. No, that's a great question. Any other sort of technical items that we want to make sure we cover? Um, Another one that came up just to make sure we speak to it is where we have ADA compliance, and it sort of notes buildings that meet um, ADA accessibility standards. So we do want to change the terminology on this one, intend to change it to read ADA accessibility. This is really about being able to access a space at a school. So the schools that sort of the way that this is graded from a data perspective on this is actually about is the building wheelchair accessible either by way of a ramp or being on grade? And then is there an elevator in the building or is it a single story building? So knowing that there's a great deal of nuance when it comes to ADA compliance and thinking about specific measurements in restrooms and other spaces, but we wanted to focus on sort of the biggest, most foundational component of that. So that is measured through like looking at all the sort of academic spaces, which is the same with air conditioning status. So what's included in both ADA and AC status are spaces that would be used by a student, presumably. So if there is, an IT closet that has air conditioning, that is not counting towards a building's overall sort of AC status in this exercise. Nazar or Michelle and team, like I'm not sure if there are any other like important pointers that came up that we can sort of give people ahead of time.
No, not that comes to mind.
Okay,
No,
great.
I'm good.
Sounds good. Well, we will go ahead. I know Nazar's got us split into some
Yeah.
breakout rooms, so we'll split up and then plan to come back
25
closer
minutes?
to the end of the hour. So yeah, we'll have
Or
about
30
20 to
minutes?
25 minutes in there.
Okay. Right, I'm gonna open them in a second.
All right.
Nate, you have to join one, okay? So I'm joining two.
I think I may.
Hey there, I'm switching my device, so I'm going to jump off and change. I'll be right back.
Great. So moving into, I guess, more of people's experience navigating the tool. For those of you sort of here that have had a chance to sort of create strategies and sort of play around with the weights or have thoughts, would love to invite you to start. I mean, we've been sort of starting off with closure merger, given that it's sort of considered to be, I'd say, the most interesting of the strategy candidate groups or most discussion worthy, if you will. So if that makes sense as a starting point. But yeah, for those of you who have had a chance to use the tool, even if you haven't submitted one yet, because I know things might change as we have the conversation this evening, but would love to hear kind of how you approach some of these criteria or even where to start when looking at something like this in terms of what is most or least important in trying to determine the priorities. And then just noting too that obviously the list will sort of auto update as you adjust the weights. But yeah, Tony, did you want to start us off?
Thanks. So, yeah, I appreciate the tool and the
Oh,
opportunity.
don't know if it's just
And
me. I can't hear you.
oh, hang on.
I could hear
Let's say
Tony.
you're unmuted. Is that just me or?
How about now?
Yep, I can hear you, Tony.
Yeah, I can hear you too.
I think it might be to me. Sorry, y'all. Can someone say something again?
Test.
Great. I'm there
Okay.
with you. Sorry.
All right. No, so just appreciate the tool and the opportunity. I thought it was pretty powerful. And honestly, that doesn't matter. But this is how I was thinking about it, right? Because if I'm using the tool properly, right, we're not changing what group these schools are in, and so the priority doesn't like add new schools into the closure consideration or remove them entirely.
In progress.
It's just the priority. So for me, knowing we've kind of already looked at these things,
Recording in progress.
I rated the academic performance and the building condition the highest, just to put it most simply, because the closure schools are already low utilization. You know, they're kind of already looked at these things. That's kind of where I put it, and one of the driving factors was thinking about the conversation about what other districts have experienced and knowing that when you close schools, you're likely to see enrollment loss. Just to be totally candid, right? Like if we want more students in high performing schools and knowing that closing schools tends to result in enrollment declines, you know, like that where can we could probably most afford to close the schools that are performing the lowest academically, and that if you're trying to capture one thing that says, is this a building that we want to hold on to, it's the overall building condition. So that was kind of why I put those two at the top, but it wasn't, you know, simple or easy necessarily to come to that.
Yeah, no, really appreciate you sharing. And just before I forget to ask, were there specific numbers, Tony, that you landed on in terms of what those percentages could be? And I guess, did you also were those the only two factors you considered? So the other ones were sort of off the table, or were they just at lighter scores? And we don't have to go through like category by category for you. I don't mean to grill you on it, but more so just to make sure I'm understanding correctly.
Yeah, I just drew down the other ones and kept those at I think 50%.
Okay.
I think the pre-1978 building risk was already at zero. So like things that were at zero stayed there.
Gotcha. And just to speak to your earlier question, yeah, the groups are sort of worked through using that sort of preliminary sorting tree, which I know there's a link up here to get to the previous presentation that sort of walks through that whole process that came in the first phase. But if anybody does want to glance back at that, I do have it pulled up here just to show sort of how those groupings were created. So
Understood.
Be there. But yeah, thank you so much for sharing. Monica, did you want to jump in?
Well, I was just going to say, as I was working with moving the different criteria in the weighting criteria, it seemed like the same schools, and if I didn't go through every single possibility, but it seemed like a lot of schools kept rising to the top. I was seeing similar results as I played with the different weighting criteria. I think in the end, the one I submitted I was looking at academic performance and building utilization, for all the reasons that Tony had just mentioned. But it seemed like it was arriving at similar conclusions, which might be an indicator that's, that makes sense. Sorry, kind of just an observation.
No, yeah, thank you so much. And just to speak to like the rankings on the list, and sometimes it's easier to, as you scroll down, to see more of the changes happening lower on the list if there is lesser variance, if you will, sort of with some of those schools that are farther down. But yeah, Monica, I think one of the items you touched on was utilization as well. Do you have an idea of like where did that land for you in comparison to the other ones for academic performance and
Oh, could you say that again? Sorry.
I'm just curious if you're able to share just where utilization felt like was, I guess, those three were all sort of equal: utilization, building condition, and academic performance for you?
Yeah, I kind of thought about them as similarly. I think I ended up putting them around 70% for each of them, keeping, I think, building condition, building utilization, and academic performance, putting those close to 70%, and then leaving the other ones as is, just to keep things relatively simple.
Got it. Yeah, thank you for sharing. Anyone else want to share about their sort of approach and thinking through these different items?
Um, this is Jessica. And I was just thinking about how, it totally makes sense, what the previous people said. And just to kind of play devil's advocate, to think about like the inverse possibility that like the things that are very hard to control, I'd say, are students in the attendance area, student economic status, how old the building is, maybe. Those are like relatively fixed, but actually utilization rate and academic performance, like we can shift those, um, you know, through various other measures outside of this. So I don't know. I just wonder about that idea of like, which are the things that are the most fixed, um, weighing those less, and the things that are the most changeable, um, being high. And I guess everybody has a different view of like what's fixed and what's easy to change. But I do think, academic performance could change instantly if, new principals, new teachers, a whole new system comes that works. Great. I guess that's the dream, but I just curious about people's thoughts about that, about kind of looking at it the inverse way as well.
That's a really interesting and I think thought-provoking way of looking at it, and assuming the potential for positive change. So I think that's making me rethink some of what I already laid out.
I think that's a really good point, Jessica. Partially because I think what we have noticed and what I think these many meetings have kind of shown is that like there are things that are really steady in the district, including like enrollment decline and the buildings are not getting younger, right? And so like those are also steady. And so like we know that a school that has a utilization rate, I'm looking at like Douglas on the list right now, only has 100 students, right? Like uh that is probably actually just going to keep going down unless something really dramatic happens. And so like utilization rate kind of feels like an important one. Obviously that can change again with admin, with, certain programs opening or closing and that kind of stuff. But the general trend is a downward decline. And so like highlighting like how do we kind of shore up what we know are going to be either like those constants or those things that are already demonstrating decline. How do we make sure that we can like, I don't know, hoist those? How do we shore up what we know is going to be an issue?
Just to echo, I would agree. Jessica, I really appreciate you playing devil's advocate on that and sharing your perspective. I just want to make sure I heard you correctly, though, in terms of like weighting the categories. Were you saying that you thought it made more sense to place a higher weight on sort of the fixed items or a higher weight on the variable items?
Yeah, I haven't submitted mine and I'm still definitely in process, but I think a higher weight to me on some of those more fixed items. Like if we close 5 schools and send a bunch of kids to Douglas, it's a new facility. Like it could have this like totally different life. It's actually a great building with some really good bones. Yeah, so I'm still thinking it through, but I think I'm leaning a little bit towards weighing more those things that are fixed and weighing less some of those things that can change through policy.
I would echo that. From like I'm an engineer, from an engineering perspective, it's kind of a unique opportunity here to offload some potential liabilities with these older buildings. And yeah, the cost to continue to maintain these older buildings is only going to increase. And with the ADA compliance and the lead, like the building condition is a big opportunity to prioritize. The other thing with the utilization, I would say like that's an opportunity for those utilization schools that are higher than 100%. Like maybe that's an indicator that they're doing something really great there that's attracting students to that program. And maybe there's some target interviews that we could do with those staff, those principal and teachers and parents about what's going really well at that school so that we could try to replicate that at other schools.
I mean, I think a lot of the schools that are overutilized are ones that are like have specialty programs. So, two of the Montessori schools are over 100%. Um, Dual language immersion languages tend to be ones that are higher. And so they are the specialty programs, right? And so a lot of the schools that are on this list are not specialty programs. And so it is worth noting that, but at the same time, some of the other specialty programs, so like, out of I think there's 8 Montessori schools, like 2 or 3 of them are at over 100% capacity, and then like 3 or 4 of them are, closer to 50%. So it's also a little bit of a toss up there.
Nicole, did you want to share?
Yeah, just going to the utilization rate. So first of all, I completely agree that, just coming from a government background, thinking about the building condition, to me, that's highest because, yeah, we have a lot of buildings that we can't afford to maintain. We probably want to offload them. Um, when it comes to utilization rate, I think I agree that's one of the things that can change, but I think there's just a lot more complex factors about that. Like just going back to the example of Douglas, I know that that's a building that MPS has thought about a lot because it's a nice building, it's in good condition. And I think that there's just a lot of factors that are contributing to why they can't fill that school. Like one of them, I think, is the traffic around there. One of them is transportation. So the ones that are the low utilization rates, I feel like there's like neighborhood and environmental factors that in many cases contribute to them not being able to fill them up, and it's not quite as obvious. So while I realize that can change, it's just one of those things that it seems like a simple solution, but often it's not, and you have to look at each individual school to know what the reason is why those individual schools aren't full.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. And just to sort of uh, emphasize and the point you're making too is like there's not a clear cut right way to approach any of this stuff. And I think arguments can be made or counterpoints can be made all around in terms of um, what that could look like. And Deborah, just seeing your note, yeah, in terms of something we did talk about is just and Deborah, I don't know if you want to share just in terms of like this sort of location perspective.
Yeah, well, so in another one of the areas, because Lloyd Barbie is not on the closer merger list, but they are on one of the other ones, they have a very low building score. And one of the things that we kind of also talked about is that like that's the school building is very old, but also that street that it's on is on Teutonia is just incredibly fast. People do not slow down. There are no speed bumps, which like the city has put in at other areas. There are speed bumps close to MPS schools, to slow folks down. But that does become a conversation where it's like, theoretically, Lloyd Barbie is right next to Rufus King. And at the same time, it's like a world away because it's on a much busier street than King is.
Yeah, and I think it all sort of rolls up too to these points. It's hard to know what that right sort of list of criteria is, knowing that there are a lot of additional considerations that come into place. So I do like, I guess, let me also take the time to be a broken record on the notion of like data informed, not data driven in terms of how we're approaching this. Like this is not to say like, great, the priority score is X, it is now the top choice and therefore a decision done. It is really to try to guide the approach and have that as the sort of starting point or the area to then work in the know-how, the knowledge, the expertise, the community context, and all those other pieces. So that being said, please, Nicole, I appreciate you mentioning just some of the challenges with Douglas as an example. So if there are other considerations, like I definitely want to make sure, please don't assume that we have heard them already. And yeah, I guess one other point too, that just from some of the other meetings I know, I believe it was in the East Region meeting that we had last week, it got brought up just thinking about like Denver public schools, where their big priority when closing and merging schools or going through that process was to make sure that kids went to a higher performing school. So Tony, kind of like you were saying, in terms of that being something that they wanted to be able to prioritize and lift up throughout the process. And just thinking about the sort of tug between that and the notion of focusing on the fixed sort of items and wanting families to feel like they're being, like that tug of prioritizing the families and like what their students need and also like the long-term sustainability of the district, whereas like one building may be poorly performing. And I'm not even sure that's a question, but just if somebody has thoughts on that or any other pieces as it relates to closure merger.
Nate, I just think you explained that like push and pull really well. One question I had, and I'm sorry if I like missed where this is where does like the density or the geographic location of these rankings get sorted out? Like, could there be a weight that's proximity to another school, peer, a same grade level school, or yeah, and then when you sort it, would you make sure that you're not, only closing things in one neighborhood? And is that's the most difficult part that doesn't happen, via this tool?
Yeah. No, it's a great point. And so just to jump to this, actually, this is, when you look at that pathway to closure merger, so below 50%, and enrollment decline over the last 5 years. So that's year over year, sort of declining on average through all of those years, and then proximity to another underutilized school. So if there is a school, for example, that is in a more isolated situation, and really maybe um, in a sense where it may really be that a more of a community asset in the sense that that is the school in that neighborhood, and uh, that was the attempt to sort of make sure that those are not sorted into the closure merger group. So the schools that are on this list are ones that are in close proximity um, to other schools that would be able to sort of serve that same student body. But it's a really good point. So
There
I
is
don't,
part of the tool that when you go down, it says what the like areas are and like whether or not you like balanced it properly, right? Like there it is, the impact. So like once you like go through, I know I kept getting school board district 4 kept not being balanced for me.
yeah. Yeah, there's a lot as you scroll down, just in terms of trying to make sure that we're helping people start to think through the different impacts and analyses there. And then, uh, Justin, I know you had sent me a point too, in an email, if I can uh, ask you if you're willing to share just in
Yeah.
terms of
Yeah.
additional considerations.
Yeah, I had referenced the green and healthy schools. There are now 36 schoolyards that have been redeveloped with asphalt removed at schools and green spaces and outdoor classrooms. I don't know if that criteria has hit this because this has been kind of more on the inside of the building, but some of the things that we've talked about in the past are, reduction in heat and a number of other factors, but those green and healthy schoolyard components would help in the long term as well. There's some studies around social emotional well-being and academic and enrollment data around that. Um, And then there's also conservation easements. So if those schools were selected, MPS would have additional liabilities trying to offset the easements that are on those properties. But it's really more of a kind of a hidden value that might not be kind of sucked up into the matrix here. But it, yeah, that comment, there's one, and then a separate comment, I'll have the floor for a moment, is consideration possibly of other schools that have already been closed by MPS in the last 30 years. We're kind of looking at it right now, but there have been other school closures, and I don't know if that helps or if that kind of shades some of our conversation as well, um, or at least maybe provides some context that might be helpful in determining how the schools could be closed and what could come after closure.
Uh, yeah, I think it's a great point in terms of making sure we're like focused on the history and how it was done previously, um, to make sure that those are sort of uh, thoughts throughout the process. Sorry, we just had somebody join who I'm trying to let into the room. But yeah, sort of learning what missteps or items missed or lessons learned along the way, that can, sort of be applied going forward. There was somebody in the East region meeting, Bob Peterson, who I think was the former school board president, who was talking about when Hopkins and Lloyd were merged, and just like some of the misses that happened along the way, and maybe why it didn't result in as well of a sort of outcome as had been originally intended or hoped for, throughout the process. So, and I think that is something that has been sort of driven home throughout the process for us, just to give that context and perspective from our end. The MPS team, and Nicole, I know you were part of these conversations too, is just like really reiterating that, the support throughout the process. And like, if we're going to be looking at a closure merger, making sure that families and staff members and those local school communities are supported with the transition, and we're not just saying, "Great, there you go, like go over there and now make it work." So, and welcome, Carlos. Sorry for the trying to breakout room ad is new experience, but I know we have a little bit of time left here, and then we'd like to just sort of come back to the larger group, and share out some of the conversations we're having. But maybe if we want to jump to one of the investment ones, one of the pieces I do want to make sure that we touch on, and we've been trying to cover in the meetings, is this sort of yellow box. So prioritizing schools expected to receive students. So if there were a closure merger, and this is also sort of tied to that clustering approach too that we had talked about earlier in the process, where closure merger schools are in geographic clusters, so as to say, if you're looking at, if there are 3 elementary or K-8 schools in a cluster, one of them is closed, for example, should that make those other 2 schools top priorities, or top candidates for an investment to try to mitigate the impact on that community? Oh, I guess we're getting called back. All right. Well, if folks want to share once we come back together, that would be great. And now we're
Okay, I just need to record so I don't miss anything from the notes. Okay, so the way we worked through this the last couple of days is essentially we've gone through the different pieces. I don't know if we're going to mainly focus on 4 unless anyone has a question about step 1, 2, 3. But just to give you a brief recap of what Nate just walked you through, this video will be up soon. Step 1, you can sort by individual school or by school board district, to kind of see a summary. And then step 2 is just an interactive map. Again, these colors are the different strategy candidate groups. So, and if you zoom in, you can kind of see the name of each school and see the schools next close to it. Step 3 is kind of a summary. This one kind of has a ton of stuff, and I'd recommend, if you haven't had time, to kind of delve into it. So in addition to the school details, equity overview, so this kind of looks at district wide. And then step 4 is where we'll work through it together. And I know we've received some submissions from each of you, but I guess what would be useful is kind of hearing a little bit about how people work through these, whether you submitted it or not. I know some people in the last couple of days played around with the weightings, but they didn't necessarily email it to us and where you had questions. So probably we can start with closure merger, the different um, weightings. Like how important do you think utilization should be in this consideration, for example?
Can I ask a quick question before
Of
we
course.
so with the different can we go back to step 2 that has the geographic map?
Yes.
Um I
Oops, sorry.
From my experience in MPS, a central question has always been how resources are being shared throughout the regions and whether that's equitable or not.
Hmm.
And so one of the first things that I seem to jump out at me is that the building additions, so my question is around this, is that the building additions are mainly on the south side, which I think will cause some red flags for folks.
Okay.
So I'm wondering, um, am I making a correct assumption that building additions, like, is there any parallel to the amount of money? Because it seems that the ones that would cost money would be the building and programs, building additions, like those 4 in the middle.
Yeah.
And so is there like, the building and programming, would that be the same amount of money but split in between 2 different things? Or is there any way to think about how much capital we're talking about? Because at the end of the day, I I don't know, but it feels like thinking about how we're spreading the capital across the geography of Milwaukee would be an important, people will ask about that.
Okay. I'll weigh in and then we'll see if Michelle has additional insights. But I think the pretty much outside of monitoring and the site-specific evaluation, they all more or less cost money. It will still cost money to merge schools, to move students, to kind of make allowances for that. I think there isn't necessarily an assigned amount to say this is how much it would cost to do a programmatic investment because it's a little bit localized. Like programs are different. They cost different amounts of money to add one program versus another, like to start a Montessori versus an IB program. Like that kind of, there is not a clear apples to apples comparison, if that helps.
Yeah, and I guess just to kind of chime in, and I think that's a really interesting way of, thinking about these different categories. So one of the ways in which I am approaching it and how I anticipate we're going to use this information is, again, kind of emphasizing the development of the plan. So we need to set in front of everybody an approach to take to start addressing the needs of the district. So, and again, this is, we keep calling it a 10-year plan, 20-year plan. I think most of us would agree it far exceeds those numbers. To see the, all of these kind of come true. So I think what this will allow us to do is to look at those priorities and, use this information based on potentially our available budget. So if we don't have a lot of money, we can still move forward, maybe doing some of these things that are, as clearly identified, lower cost versus if we do have let's just say there's another ESSER style program, right, where the federal government drops a lot of money on us. Now we'll have a plan and we'll know where to go with it, right? So that is one of the goals of this long range plan.
Thank you. Other thoughts, questions? All right. I guess, does anyone want to share how they kind of approach this, if you worked on it or kind of played around with the tool? Like how important, like what's the most important metric here, or which ones are
Yeah,
less important? Um,
yeah, I can share my thoughts on it, but I'm curious to hear everyone else's too. To me, the closure category is probably the linchpin of the whole thing. And it's like we have to get that right before you can do anything else. It feels to me. And so getting closure right, I think really matters. And in some ways, I think maybe we have too many categories here and maybe it makes it a little too confusing. So for me, as I'm looking at it, it feels to me like building closure should really be all about two things. It should be about how how well utilized is the building, um, whether there's available capacity nearby, which doesn't really seem to be addressed in the sliders. It would be interesting if we could add a slider for available capacity within 2 miles or something like that, so that you could kind of track that as part of it. And
mhm,
then it's about building condition, right? Because you're measuring long term. So all the other categories I think matter, but they for making the decision about what to close, the other categories probably matter less. Those other categories like economic status and things like that to me matter more after you've made the decision about what building to close,
mhm,
because other buildings nearby are going to take those students. And so then to me it matters a whole lot that when you close someone's building, we're investing in those students and that we're ensuring that we're creating capital improvements in the buildings that they're going to address the inequity, so that closing the building is not a hardship but actually is creating an opportunity for students to move forward into a better state. And to me that's kind of the key, and that's kind of how I viewed it. So to me it's utilization rate and building condition are really the two that matter here, and then it's the other categories for how do you invest then afterwards.
mhm. Interesting. Thank you, Bob. Any thoughts on what Bob said? Like, anyone think anything else is very important, or do you agree, disagree?
I agree. Sorry, Paula, go ahead.
Thanks, Jim. I'm wondering about, I think Bob has kind of hit the nail on the head as far as getting the closure category right. I think there's a lot of wisdom in what you say about that. I'm wondering, though, about utilization rate as it relates to building condition. Um, and I don't have an answer. I'm just thinking kind of out loud. Is that is do we know what the factors of the utilization rate, what impacts that? Is it the building condition? If the building condition were improved, would that increase the utilization rate? Or are there other factors that would have to be resolved for a particular school to be utilized more?
Mhm,
So just kind of a question about that. And then just one additional thought. As I was playing around with the tool, one frustration I had was that I wanted to be able to compare um, sort of different levels of schools together. So, for example, I wanted to look at all the high schools because if you're going to move students around, if there's a closure, then what are the other high schools? Where are they? What are their other assets? Um, so I'm just wondering if that is something that could happen,
So
or
we've
if
heard,
it's there.
yeah, so two things. We heard a little bit of similar feedback, and I think someone was like something as simple as adding a column here that tells you what kind of schools these are, so that when you sort, you can see this is a K-8 versus a high school. And I think to the point of schools in close proximity, so everything in this, those kind of that first round of putting everything in these different buckets. And in that round is where basically every school in this bucket has a school within a mile of it. Every school on this list. So there was kind of a first iteration of prioritization that got them into this list. So that was already taken into account, like nearby schools that would kind of be able to absorb the displaced kids. But on the sorting by school type, we heard that feedback, and yeah, it's something that we can at least think about how to add even a column here that just tells you um, the differences.
So when we adjust the sliders, we're only picking from the schools that you've already assigned to that list.
Yes, because there was already
So
a short list. So, oh, go ahead. Sorry, finish your thought.
I was just going to, I was just clarifying. I thought we were reprioritizing that list when we changed the sliders, but we're really not. You're just changing the order within the list. You've
Yes.
already categorized the school, and that category isn't changing.
Yes, so you're reprioritizing. So there is a round one that already put them here.
That's kind of, I would argue, a little disappointing because it feels like you're not actually, yeah, it feels like we're accepting your initial grouping completely without actually being able to experiment with how you got to there. I didn't quite realize how limited our ranking was.
Noted.
Could you talk a little bit more about why academic performance wasn't on your list? So thank you for starting us off. I know this is really a hard thing, but I'm just wondering if we had a building that wasn't in great condition, and maybe, was in the middle of the utilization, but was performing better. I mean, probably none of these schools are like our A plus, but was doing better than the rest. That wouldn't be a factor that you'd want to think about?
I mean, it's an interesting question. I think the way I was kind of thinking about it, I'm thinking our task here is really to look at the buildings themselves, and it feels strange to me to punish a building or reward a building based on its academic performance. To me, it feels like what we should be doing is trying to create a level playing field where everybody has opportunities that are matched. And so if you look at a school that's underperforming academically, I don't know if that means it needs to close. To me, it means more that it needs additional resources invested into it so that it can be, so that students in that area can be brought up. To me, the reason you close a building is because the building's empty, right? There aren't enough students to fill it. And that's a non-sustainable issue. So if you keep the closure about that and then say, okay, now we've got students from these closed buildings that have to go somewhere. So now how do we bring them up and how do we invest in the buildings that they're going to so that they're rising up? So I guess what I'm saying isn't that academic performance doesn't matter. I'm saying I don't think academic performance matters for this category. I think it matters more for where you invest. I don't know if that makes sense or not. It's just my way.
It makes sense. And I think over the last couple of meetings, we've heard similar sentiments. Actually, we've had people on very different ends of that. I think it should be part of this, and other people, someone else shared exactly that, was like it would seem punitive if that was what you used as a measure to close a school. And so we've kind of heard that it shouldn't be accounted for on the closure merger.
Rogers, it looked like you really agreed with that. Could you articulate, talk more about, because I guess my gut instinct, just to share, is that building culture is really hard. And from my perspective, building culture is actually harder than fixing a building. And so if we have a school that has a culture that's working, to destroy or to not privilege that on some level, I think is, I don't know. But I hear your argument that having an equal playing field. So, Roger, you seem to really agree with him. So can you talk more about your thinking?
Well, I think culture refers to the norms and the values and the expectations in the building. whereas climate will refer to how people behave within the building based on those norms and values and cultures and expectations. I initially thought academic performance is key. Nonetheless, however, in talking about a long-range master facilities plan for the Milwaukee Public School District, I tended to lean toward what Bob said, that academic performance is one issue alone, and the building condition is another issue. Certainly, if the roof is leaking, we want to address that because that certainly takes kids' attention away from what the teacher is saying if the classroom is leaking, or if the stairs are cracking, or the sidewalks are cracking, or we have any inadequate kitchen facilities where food is cooked. That's an issue that needs to be addressed and does not um, does not exist on par with academic performance. So I think he makes a very interesting point, and that's why I agreed with him about academic performance being one issue, but right now we're looking at the building conditions is the other. Did I make sense?
Yes. Thank you for
Thank you.
sharing.
Mhm.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on, and maybe any of the others? Maybe we can touch up on anyone, any preference? Or do we want to stay on closure merger? We can do that too.
Is ADA compliance also in the building score? I'm just wondering if it's being double counted.
No. It isn't in both. Because the building score accounts for, I guess it does in some extent, but I think ADA is a percentage of just the learning spaces that are the places that students use that are ADA compatible. A building score kind of takes, I believe, that into account, AC status as well as energy consumption, kind of averages it out.
Yeah, I mean, based on the definition, ADA and AC status are both in there. I actually had the same comment, Rebecca. To me, it feels like it would make sense if we're going to call them out as their own separate categories to take them out of the building condition score then.
This is Paula again.
Yep.
I'm just looking at the discussion questions and want to go back to what was said just a little while ago about about school culture. And so the first question has to do with potential impacts on the student experience. And I'm thinking about that, and what I think was accurately depicted is that if you have a really strong culture within a school that supports high academic performance, you know, regardless really of the building condition, even though good building condition, is highly desirable. But I wonder if there are closures that have to be made where there is a strong culture, if there could be some assurances made or provisions made for those students who would have to change schools. For example, could there be guarantees that families could stay together if that was an important thing, where siblings were at the same school, or that the children within a certain grade level could be that there would be some ability for some of those kids to stay together, because I think at any age, when you go from something that's very familiar and comfortable to something that's new and maybe you have to travel in a different way, it can be very difficult. So I think we just need to keep in mind, upon implementation, that whatever we can do to minimize that negative impact on the students, it would be, I think, extremely beneficial to the students, their families, and also to the success of implementing the plan.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, and I can just speak in the past. I mean, we've merged schools and we've had to close schools. We've done it in the past. And I do recall, although I wasn't specifically involved with the enrollment process, I do recall a few things like these families were given like front of the line. So we tried to make sure that they got enrolled first, right? So they had kind of first choice of where they wanted to go. And some other initiatives where they would bring staff to help the parents enroll. I think in some cases they even brought them to the school. So I think what you're expressing is something that I think we would definitely try to achieve, to obviously keep families together. I think that's critical.
Yeah. And that's why kind of taking the merger approach is good. The idea is that you would, um, keep friends together and kids together. It won't always happen because some parents will decide to go elsewhere, but they should be taught an intention behind those actions.
In that way, this is thinking if it is really a 20-year plan, it almost feels like there should be a group when, whatever schools are chosen to be closed, working on the process of closing the school, and maybe another group or at least equal time given to the schools nearby and thinking through how to welcome the students in, because I think that, and I'm not going to be able, I'm a little bit tired tonight to pull back the right names, but there are some examples of schools merging in the Bayview community that really took a really high performing school, and there are kind of some sad stories about what happened to that school. So I think that there's some risk here, and thinking about how to situate to make it a great, how to make the move strong would be an element to consider and to put investment into.
Sorry, I realized 25 minutes was nowhere near enough, but I guess we have more to cover. So
Yes. Yeah, I know. Our group was in it too. So just wanting to, so Nazar, I'm not sure where you all left off, but we were just sort of starting to cover to some of the pieces about prioritization, but maybe before we try to move on to new items or carry that on, I don't know if somebody from either group is willing to sort of share some of the takeaways and perspective that was shared within the group and just provide maybe a quick summary for the larger crowd. We can invite you to come off mute. Either group, any individual.
We were looking at the impact, and correct me if I'm wrong, please. We were looking at the impact of academic performance on a building's culture. And I don't think there was any disagreement about levels of academic performance, but I think we were talking about whether or not if academic performance increases, how does that impact a building's closure, or whether the building's condition depending on what that condition is sufficient enough to affect uh, academic performance. Did I get that right? Those who were in my group, that's what I took away from. That's what I took away from that discussion. Or did I err in my summary?
No, I think you were good. Yeah, I think there was a sort of shared sentiment that like uh, taking into account like letting academic performance influence whether you close or merge a school could feel punitive. Like a school kind of underperforming means it needs support, not necessarily that. So, and I think um, Bob highlighted that to him, the only important things under closure merger would be utilization and building condition and whether there's a school nearby that can absorb, and kind of the rest are not as important. And I think that was something we were
Right.
kind
And
of
I don't
hopeful.
think I don't think we're gonna resolve, um, I don't know if it's a dichotomy or not. I don't think we're gonna resolve whether or not the condition of a building um, influences or impacts or interferes with academic performance. I think there are two distinct categories. And I wonder if there is another way of discussing a weighting strategy without using without using the term building closure, or if we were to reframe our thinking and not think in terms of closure, but think in terms of something else. That would be a weighty discussion to have. Is there something else that we can do besides closing buildings? What does closing a building do? I mean, is closing the building going to make kids healthier? Or, I mean, we had the lead issues, but I guess they closed some buildings temporarily. I assume that those buildings will be open again in the fall once the lead issue has been resolved. Did I make sense? Or I'm confusing the issue that we're talking about.
So you made sense. Thank you for sharing.
You're welcome. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, does anybody, and I know I've
I
been
mean,
talking a lot, does anybody want to respond? Yeah, Michelle, go ahead.
yeah, it's one of the things that I've heard from the group, that I was just part of, with
Mhm.
Dr. Onick and a few others, from the prior meetings is, and even earlier meetings is, we need to somehow emphasize that closing a building should mean investing in that neighborhood or in that community, particularly because many of these are kind of clustered. So, and it to me is just natural because these are some of our oldest facilities in the oldest parts of the city. So, it's not to me, it's just kind of more of a geographical, historical phenomena. But I think you're kind of hitting on something that, the closure merger category does not mean, it shouldn't mean, it should it shouldn't mean like something bad. It should actually, exude excitement and opportunity and, refresh and, renewed growth. So somehow wrapping that into it and then literally changing the name. And I think that's something that I've
Yes,
heard from these
yes,
groups, so maybe
yes.
that's an okay thing.
Yeah. Thank you all for sharing. And just to build off of that too, I know early on we did talk about like the importance of being able to point out how any of these strategies are going to positively impact students and make that experience better for them, right? Like if we are saying that an underutilized school or an under-enrolled school is dealing with these challenges, and now by doing, by taking these steps, we can provide a greater teaching staff or more academic opportunities or smaller class sizes or some of these things that matter and have a sort of an objectively positive outcome for students, just based in something that is sort of a shared understanding of what is a positive outcome. But yeah, thank you, group. Other group. I want to call group and other group from my perspective. I'm sure you would say the inverse, but if my group, if does anyone care to share just kind of a high level overview of what we were covering?
I can share a little. I think we had a really good conversation, very similar to what Rogers was saying in terms of kind of the push and pull between is academic, like the perception of what elements of this are fixed versus variable, and is academic performance variable versus building condition fixed, and things like that. So I thought it was a really good discussion, and looking at some of the other districts had prioritized academic performance so that the schools that are receiving students, are higher performing than the schools where students came from. But again, the opposite thing that does a more modern facility provide a better opportunity to create a future high performing school, kind of like what we heard the other group discuss. Just a quick note, just looking at that closure, if you put 100% weight on academic performance and put everything else to zero, one interesting thing from my perspective is that some of the schools that fall to the bottom of the list in terms of the schools that would be least likely to be decommissioned or moved into some other facility, some of those like La Follette are like the oldest buildings. So you've got some relatively higher academic performance maybe in some buildings that you wouldn't consider to be the strongest, and some of the schools that are towards the top. It's a mix all across, but some of the schools that are at the top of Starnes Discovery is probably one of the newest buildings in MPS, relatively speaking. And if you just weighted on academic performance, that actually, floats toward the top for, choosing to invest elsewhere or decommissioning the school. So I think it's a really interesting and complex part of the discussion.
Well, I thank you for that. And Rebecca talked early on at the beginning of our meeting about equitable distribution of resources across the district. And it led me now to wonder whether or not, if you have an underutilized school that is a high achieving school, would you want to consider um, moving that, closing that school, to use a, for lack of a better word, shutting that school down and moving the kids out because you projected an enrollment of 1,000 and they only have 755 kids in it. I'm not sure that underutilization equates to poor academic performance. And I'm not sure that any of us are saying that, but I think underutilization may get too much, may be getting too much attention. Middle school principals decade ago decided what a reasonable enrollment for middle schools would be, and we set that number, and we all aim to reach that number for a middle school to be functional. You needed this kind of enrollment because that would give you a counselor, that would give you FIED, that may give you a music teacher, that may even give you may not give you a shop teacher, but it would give you the teachers that you need to perform at give you the tools and the resources to perform well with the kids that you had in the building. So I'm not sure about waiting. I did not weight utilization, I don't think, that heavily. If I did, I would change my mind now based on what I've heard tonight. Thanks, Rebecca.
And just to note on that too, I think it's a really salient point too about utilization tries to correct for, putting things on the same scale when you're looking at an elementary school that wouldn't have 1,000+ kids versus a high school that would have 1,000+ kids. But also that point of like, what is the sweet spot in terms of enough students enrolled in a school where it
Right.
allows the school to operate at a healthy level
Yes.
and in a sustainable way from a financial perspective, which
Yes.
is another
Yes.
conversation. And some of that piece that we'll get to in the next step with the policy pieces in terms of some of the things that are existing within administrative policies within MPS are target school
Right.
sizes.
And if we have underutilization, do we have overutilization?
Yes. Yeah. So even if you start to jump, like if we jump to another category, for example, and look at building investment. So I think it's a great time to point out too that these descriptions are really important because on the closure merger list, they're almost mostly inverted in the sense that a lower utilization will prioritize, meaning put you to the top of the list, whereas now higher utilization will put you prioritize top of the list if you choose that as a strong criteria, obviously. But definitely wanting to point out those as important details. But when you do that, you'll see that the schools at the top, Dr. Onik, are above 100%. So those are those schools that are over enrolled. And I think if you jump to the building addition category, I would imagine you'll see that to a much greater degree where you have the schools that are, up in the 180, 168%. So really, these are, as we've talked about in the past, having 40 plus
Yeah.
kids in a classroom is also not
Mhm.
ideal for student experience. So anyway, I'm going to pipe down.
Hmm.
Nate, could you go to the second option that has the geographic map?
Absolutely.
So I came to MPS through a Javits grant, and even though we had significant gains on multiple measures, um, in the end, it wasn't received well. And one of the reasons was I didn't know the schools as I should have, but we were mainly working with schools on the South Side. And so from that personal experience, I can tell you that one way that this map will be viewed is how resources are shared on the North and the South Side. So knowing that and seeing closures, the black dots in the central and north sides, and seeing, probably the orange dots being the most money, and maybe building in programmatic, it's not equivalent to say that each area equals a certain weight of money, but in some ways it does. Because to build a whole new building is going to cost more or add a whole new addition, and people are going to see that in a certain way. So I think if, I hear this as a, 10, 20-year plan, and I think in order for it to build up to be a 10, 20-year plan, fairness needs to be seen. Geographic spreading of resources needs to be seen in the beginning stages. So if we're gonna do, close a school on the north side, let's pick one, let's spread our closures out and make sure that our resources are also spread out so that because it's just it's a narrative that MPS I think has really embedded in how we look at things. And so if we're playing right into that narrative, I think it'll cause a lot of friction.
Rebecca, when you talk about resources, are you talking about state allocations to school districts, and then those allocations are allotted to the schools within those districts? What are you talking?
I'm just saying, so this plan is a plan to determine how we will spend money on our infrastructure. And so I'm saying wherever that money is coming from, we need to think about it in a equitable but also geographic way, because I think there's a long-term narrative that tie those things together.
Yeah, it's actually a great sort of transition to into where our group left off was kind of this box and going back to the clustering approach that was mentioned. If there are schools near each other and you're looking at two elementary schools that are close by and one of them were to close, should that make that next closest school the top candidate for an investment to try to mitigate the disproportionate impacts and not only be taking away from a more geographic community in that sense too if that was a strong community resource. So and that's kind of what this question is meant to capture the spirit of, and I know it's a binary yes or no, so obviously we'd love for people to elaborate in the text box or even just via email, whatever is easiest for y'all. But I don't know if anybody wants to share thoughts on that too, in terms of saying like, should schools in the same area where a closure merger would happen, would that region be, prioritized for or in it for an investment? So at a more high level.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely 100% essential. You can't just close buildings without investing in the students whose buildings are getting closed. Otherwise, these are already the students who are getting the shaft because they're going to schools that are underutilized and therefore underfunded, because utilization and funding is also linked, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the schools that are underutilized have less programming because they have less funds per student, because more of their funds are spent on taking care of an oversized building versus programming. And so these are students who are already underserved. And if we close their buildings, the only way that we can move towards equity is by investing in those students, by investing in the buildings that they are going to, and ensuring that the programs and the facilities are brought up to snuff for them, so that we can move beyond thinking of closure as a punitive thing and think instead more positively about merging as increasing opportunity.
Nicole, did you want to?
Yeah, I want to say overall, I do agree with that, right? Because it's once you, and I think I read this, and Nate, you guys may have actually shared this, or maybe Michelle did a long time ago, but that I think it was Chicago or some school district when they closed buildings, then it ended up having an impact of further disinvesting in neighborhoods that were historically marginalized, because then you just had more shuttered buildings. However, I just think one thing that we need to be able, to talk about is the fact that a lot of the students who live in those disinvested neighborhoods are traveling outside of their neighborhoods, and that there is a real problem with attracting people to their neighborhood school. And so I just don't, I don't have a solution here, but I just don't think that that's something that we can ignore because of that safety perception that is, such a big issue in Milwaukee.
Well, and the other part of it is if you look at the map that Justin shared and you map it onto the map of school closures, you can see that the schools that are in like the largest area, which is the central region of like closure mergers, are also the areas of the city that are depopulating the fastest, right? And so I understand the concern around, north side versus south side. And again, like that goes into the geographic and racial politics that go into that, right? But it is also noticeable that there is population growth in certain areas of the city versus others. And some folks are prioritizing going to their neighborhood schools versus others. And so I do think that that's also something to be, considerate of, is like if we're going to invest in schools, we want folks to go to their neighborhood schools. Absolutely. We want folks to be able to feel safe in their neighborhoods, have these schools around them. And at the same time, are those areas going to continue to depopulate in 10, 15, 20 years, right? So are we putting a Band-Aid solution on something, or is it, a bigger issue? I guess like that's just something that I also want to think about when we think about all of this, is that like, a lot of these areas where we have a school with 100 students that can fit 350 are also places where like they are seeing rapid decline in population.
I'd add too, like this is a lot for the school district to take on, if the city can be engaged in a meaningful way, like the Department of City Development and Community Development Block grants can be engaged to help with some of these more population scale challenges that we're dealing with. I think there's some very strong arguments about investment from the city to be able to support whatever ways MPS decides to go with this.
I agree. I think when it comes to making those decisions, if there can be further engage, like let's just say, for example, we know that there was I don't know how much it's continuing, but there has been some city investment in the Sherman Park neighborhood. Like that might be an example of a a neighborhood where we would say we're going to make sure that we're investing in buildings here because we know that the city is investing here. I believe that like with ESSER, MPS got a lot of criticism because they didn't have their plan with the way they invested funds, and they did some amazing things with buildings with that money. But I think that in some cases, many people would say they still spent like tens of thousands of dollars on schools, and they try to distribute the money equitably, but they didn't have a plan or make a large impact. And so some of these buildings that were now considering closing are schools that recently had, at minimum, I think $100,000 in COVID, funds invested in them. So I think at the end of the day, everyone wants to make sure that we're investing in neighborhoods, but that those investments are smart and everyone can get behind them in the long run. Like, let's just say Hopkins Lloyd, it's like one of the worst conditioned buildings, one of the lowest enrollment rates. Like, is that a building that is going to get invested in, or is that something that, I don't want to say we don't have faith in a school or a building, but that one has significant issues. Even if we wanted to invest in that area, would it have the impact that we desire?
There was a comment, I think, about density studies, and I don't remember where we got them, but when we did facilities planning for the public library system, we relied heavily on density studies. And I remember specifically on the near south side, when you looked at those maps, it was like bright orange because of the increasing population of Latinos and Hispanics. And there was also this trend of depopulation from more of the central city near north side, further north to the northwest side. So, and we've all seen that and experienced it. So I'm just suggesting that maybe we take a look at those and include that as another resource if we haven't already. And again, I can't remember where we got those, but I'm sure the city could help us.
Yeah, Tony, did you want to?
Yeah, Paul, I think that's a really good insight. And I do think we have to look at it like a lot of these things. There's kind of two, push and pull things, right? Just like we talked about, is academics variable versus feasibility, condition more fixed. The equity issue and north side versus south side, and where there's population growth and where there's population loss. I think the other thing with population density, which we should be considering, is the fact that so few students attend their neighborhood schools. And so population, and I think Nicole pointed this out, or someone, there are neighborhoods in the city where a lot of families do attend their neighborhood school. And then maybe population density is more meaningful there, but there's other areas where the population density may not necessarily, have a strong correlation to the attendance at the school because people are coming from other areas. So I just think there's a lot of push and pull pieces like that make this complex.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anyone else who maybe hasn't had a chance to share yet that wanted to comment or share their perspective on any of this? It's been great to hear from you all, and didn't want to end the conversation. We sort of built in the flexibility, so I promise we'll have time to get through the remaining portion of the presentation. But anybody else have any sort of final thoughts before we carry on? Going once. All right, I will pull this back up. And so, yeah, just to echo again, thank you. Sorry, is there a question in the chat? I'm not sure.
Someone, Deborah said that Obama SCTE and WCLL supposed to merge or something. Is that true?
That is what I have heard from Wickle staff, but I haven't heard anything else recently. It was like on the table, off the table, and it has not been a part of these conversations. And so I was just wondering if anybody had heard anything.
I haven't heard anything along those lines, so of course, we're not always the first to know.
But yeah, thanks for sharing. Good to keep on the radar regardless. All right, so sort of the other large part of this, right, and going back to the conversations we've had previously is, just the acknowledgement that systems do what they're designed to do, right? So how do we start to look at some of the foundational challenges that exist from a policy perspective, to try to, create lasting, sustainable change and not end up, I think we want to collectively avoid a situation where it's kicking the can down the road or having these sort of disparities show up in a different way and maybe with a different school or neighborhood or what have you. And that could come in a lot of ways. But so what we're doing is just as we've gone through the sort of duration of the project, both the first phase and sort of this steering committee process phase as well, and all the conversations we've had at previous meetings is trying to pull everything into these sort of policy initiatives that we're calling them, which is sort of a broad term in terms of whether or not they are truly an administrative policy or, as you'll see when I get to the example, maybe more of a state level sort of legislative effort. But what we've done is we'll have a dozen of these policy initiatives, and this is next week is this week. Sorry, that text should be updated. So the intent, we will have that to you this week with a form to evaluate these policies. So we've put together a not overly crammed one pager for each policy item to go through and do a sort of brief evaluation. And there's some flexibility if you would prefer not to be as brief, but making sure that we're asking important questions in this sort of first section, section A, highlighting, your level of agreement. Do you think that it will have an overall positive impact on the district? So whether you agree or disagree, how much of a priority the policy initiative should be for the district, how long you estimate it might take to implement, and then other important considerations. So improvements, refinements, conditions that are necessary for it to succeed, unintended or intended impacts or outcomes, consequences. Those are all the pieces that we're sort of suggesting. But basically, you would read through each one of these policy summaries and perform this evaluation. The second component of that survey will just be to, of course, sort of rank them in a priority sense. So through two different lenses, one being the level of urgency in terms of the importance of making or advocating or sort of moving towards a change, and then also ease of implementation. So I think a good example, and the one that we've been sharing, is just state policy reform about first-class city restrictions that apply currently only to Milwaukee Public Schools as it relates to reusing or selling closed buildings, knowing that this has been, and is sort of a major hurdle in terms of the sort of flexibility and local control about what can be done with those buildings. And so what we try to cover on each summary is what is it, like what is the policy initiative? What are we sort of suggesting? What are the intended impacts and benefits? Which guiding principles does it align with? And what are some key considerations? So in this instance, I know we've spoken about this one for a long time, but there's also been the collective acknowledgement that this will not be quick, right? Like it will not be an overnight situation to try to change state policy, and that it will require a lot of coordination with local partners and government leaders, et cetera. And then lastly, having that sort of examples or precedent item. So noting that Milwaukee is the only district in the state dealing with this, and that other large urban districts in other states, and try to keep them with ones that we've discussed before, but are not sort of held to the same restrictions. So that is one example. We'll have the form out to you in the next couple days, and trying to make it as succinct and easy to read through as possible, so as not to.
Thank you.
Yes, you got it.
You succeed. Thank you.
I haven't. No margins have been widened on this one
Okay.
pager. No sneaky moves there. So it is no tiny font or periods, and even down to that level. Anyway,
Good.
any
I love
question?
Perkins Eastman.
That's very kind of you to say. Any questions on the policy initiative evaluation process, just in terms of what's coming down the road there? All right. So last but not least, and even if we just end up leaving you with this one, honestly, they've been really fruitful conversations with the regional steering committees as well, but really just thinking about engagement going forward for the fall. So knowing that we are, likely to, be sort of hosting large scale. So just to be clear about that part, large scale, town hall style meetings to make sure that we have people's focus on the content at hand, but wanting to be and potentially surveys as well for folks who aren't able to attend in person. Wanting to be really intentional about outreach and how do we drive strong turnout. And make sure that a huge part of that being, are people aware of what is being talked about, what the project is, what we're asking them to show up for, and then the ultimate goal being that we get the right stakeholders at the table, in the sense those being those who are more likely to be impacted or historically have been underrepresented through engagement efforts, not just on this project, but with the district in general. So making sure that there is sort of a representative showing of stakeholders at these engagement events. So just a reminder that, so obviously virtual this month and next month, but in September, in place of the steering committee meetings, we would be doing more large scale engagement. So here is just that sort of phase one overview of what was done in terms of those town halls and everything. And I'm going to jump back just before we jump to that. So yeah, as I mentioned, September, in place of that, we intend to have all of you involved and are working to try to nail down dates as soon as possible, knowing that giving people runway is a huge component and very important. So on that last slide, what we've done is sort of shown a little diagram here just of all the different outreach methods that we've sort of used in the previous round, and to try to spread the word and drive turnout and have people show up. And what we have been asking folks to think on, and we can spend the last few minutes on here, is just any methods that are missing, or the specific details that matter, knowing that not all targeted email blasts are equally effective. It needs to go to the right person. It needs to have the right information. Some of the prompts that have come up before were like coming up with almost like a publicity packet to say, here's an email template, here's a social media post template, here's a tweet or whatever tweets are called now, a LinkedIn post, a Facebook post, some of these things, so that people we're making it as easy as possible for folks. Where should flyers be posted, if they should be posted, what's going to be most effective, and then any engagement turnout that you've seen that's been strong in the past. And the last note that I forgot to mention just before I do is that we would still be planning to coordinate directly for student workshops. So that is not something that we would post a flyer for. We, this superintendent student advisory committee is on our radar there. And there's already, there's been a great number of suggestions in terms of other groups to reach out to. Videos for social media, that's an awesome idea. And that was mentioned in one other one too, just having a short clip that people can watch, as opposed to I got to do the drop down and then read, and I see more than 12 lines of text, and I'm like, no, I'm not doing that. So how do we avoid that or create, a couple different approaches? So I'm going to stop talking. If anybody has specific things that come to mind, and if regional folks, if you've shared them already, we definitely have those noted. But so I want to invite folks who are maybe solely citywide, if they want to come off, or if you've thought of something new, regional folks, please share. But I'm going on mute now.
Just threw this in the chat, but if you can, not just give information at back to school and community events, but have some way to get even some initial feedback. I know you can't give a whole presentation there like you can at a town hall, but I think you're going to get broader feedback from more people if you and go where people are rather than making them come to us. Easier said than done.
Thank you for sharing, though. Duly noted. Any other thoughts? And I guess to that point, striking the right balance of, are we giving people enough context to authentically provide input to, and like trying to, that's also a tug when thinking about this. But if there are, what are the ways that would make things easier or more approachable for people to where we can, not letting perfect be the enemy of good on these things. So even just taking steps in the right direction, if folks have thoughts and ideas, and no bad ideas for sure. So and I know we're running short on time, so this is very much an open-ended question if folks want to email or share thoughts after the fact.
Nate, just to clarify, at these engagement sessions, are we going to be sharing draft or scenarios? Can you just clarify what's going to happen at those meetings?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So yeah, the intent is to have draft scenarios ready for everyone here to sort of work through at the next steering committee meeting and start to collectively evaluate, refine, et cetera. And then going through, beyond that, having the time to connect with sort of the school leadership, district leadership, school board members, and make sure that, the right folks are sort of made aware of where we land. And then once we have that sort of pass through all those steps, then we would be sharing, I think that the big piece is when we go to the broader community, it is with something to react to and less about sort of this figurative, well, what do you think about, hypothetically this and metaphorically that. So trying to avoid that at this point in the project. Yeah.
Thank you.
And Rebecca, I don't want to leave you dangling with a half answer, so I will say more to come in terms of how it will all be shaped, and sorry for the unsatisfying response to that question.
Feels like we don't have a lot of time for scenario review before you're sharing them.
Yeah. Yeah, we know that things are definitely moving, and all the more important that we are sort of driving home these pieces and trying to get people's input. So, and, to be clear, and I know we've said this, but I really do want to reemphasize the importance of like the methodology piece, given that, a gradual approach. So Rebecca, to that point, is definitely the thinking at this point is that it wouldn't be a rip the Band-Aid. And Nicole, I know you brought up like Chicago before, but where CPS, 10 years ago or so closed 50 schools overnight, and just being able to see the outcome from that approach has been informative for districts across the U.S. But I know that at the very least there would be sort of phases, I guess, yes, or cycles, or however we want to phrase it, but and that those would be updated, right? Like, it's what we don't want to do is put the district in a situation where they say, okay, well, we agreed to do this 6 years ago and it no longer feels like the right choice, but it was written down, so now people are trying to hold us to it. So really just providing that flexibility, not because the district needs to be able to change its mind on a whim, but more so because variables change, situations change, and that you want to make the best decision for that point in time.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been running my mouth through all this part where I was going to stay quiet. So hopefully it was at least helpful context. And I apologize because I see that we're now over time. But the last piece that we had on here, so was just a reminder in terms of those two steps. So keep your eyes out for an email from us in the next day or so with the information that we've talked about tonight and just where to go from there. And yeah, in the meantime, please don't hesitate to send an email or reach out with a note. And like we said, we'll have that sort of tracker to show which scenario that we received from you on what date and everything, so that we know we're operating off the correct one. You are very much invited, if you've done one already, to complete a new one if you've thought differently tonight or want to add or update anything. So, and I'll just finish by saying thank you to all of you for making the time on an evening in the summer. We really appreciate you being inside and looking at a screen with us. That's a tall ask, and we're grateful for it. So,
thank you.
Thanks.
All right.
Thank you, Nate.
Yep. Take care, everyone.